The sky was a vast blue, and the earth a deep green, with majestic mountains stretching endlessly, like great dragons lying prone and extending to the distant horizon. The entire scene was enveloped in an aura of grandeur, resembling a realm of the immortals. Yet now, the eastern mystery region was engulfed in the flames of war, and even this serene paradise could not escape unscathed. The peace was shattered by sudden, piercing screams tearing through the sky. Following the direction of the screams, one could see in the distance a thick mass of black clouds rolling across the heavens, exuding an endless aura of malevolence. Within the swirling layers of darkness, an enormous barrier of light came into view, containing within it countless massive floating islands. Mist wound around these islands, with white cranes soaring gracefully, a picture of tranquility. Yet, under the oppressive shroud of the surrounding evil miasma, that tranquility seemed all too fragile. From within the sinister clouds came constant roars. On closer inspection, countless figures filled the sky, all clad in the same attire. Each bore a black and white emblem on their chests, the insignia of the Yuan Sect. These were all disciples of the Yuan Sect. The eyes of these Yuan Sect disciples glared fiercely at the mountains and islands inside the barrier, with a wicked black glint in their gazes, casting a terrifyingly sinister aura, void of the Tao sect's usual pride. Outside the massive barrier, some figures in different attire could be seen resisting the encroaching black cloud, unleashing torrents of primordial energy. Yet, they were continuously overwhelmed by the terrifying assaults surging forth from the black cloud, and screams of agony rang out again and again. Though they struggled to hold their ground, their defenses were clearly crumbling under the relentless Yuan Sect onslaught. Amid flashing blades, blood splattered, and the scene grew indescribably brutal. "Brothers, protect the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace and slaughter these Yuan Sect dogs," shouted a figure, eyes bloodshot, roaring to the heavens, his voice filled with despair and bitter hatred. "Kill!" The disciples of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace nearby joined in the roar, unleashing waves of attacks into the dark clouds, which were met with more shrieks of agony. Their defiance only provoked more savagery in the Yuan Sect disciples, whose eyes flickered with black energy as their attacks grew even more frenzied. The Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace disciples fell one by one, the sky itself seemingly stained with their blood. At the heart of the dense black clouds, a few figures gazed coldly at the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace, shielded behind its sect protection formation. This was their last line of defense. Once it fell, the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace would be fully exposed to the Yuan Sect's blade. "Increase the assault, break the formation," ordered the figure leading them in a calm voice. "Yes, Grand Elder." Responding to his command, the Yuan Sect elites unleashed a burst of primordial energy from within the black clouds, with hints of dark energy flashing within it. Boom, boom, boom. Powerful strikes hammered against the formation, causing ripples across the barrier and dimming the shimmering lines of light. "Heh, Grand Elder, don't worry. At this rate, the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace's barrier won't last much longer," said an elder behind the Grand Elder, chuckling. Yesterday, the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace's palace master was gravely injured by the Grand Elder. He might have perished by now. Their other powerful elders are also heavily wounded. Now, the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace has only some young disciples left and can no longer resist our Yuan Sect's onslaught. The black mist parted, revealing the Grand Elder's skeletal frame and deep-set eyes brimming with dark energy. He shook his head and said coldly, "Don't underestimate the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace. According to what I know, this palace may hold a secret of the heavens and earth." "Oh!" The elders behind him froze, their faces filled with puzzlement, clearly unaware of this supposed heavenly secret. "Heh, don't ask me for details. Not even I know, nor do the three sect masters," said the Grand Elder indifferently. "Then why don't the sect masters come here themselves, given its importance?" murmured one of the elders. "The three sect masters are at the critical juncture of breaking into the revolution stage. They cannot afford any distractions. My involvement is more than sufficient for this task," replied the Grand Elder with a shake of his head. "The Grand Elder speaks truly. With the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace soon to be dealt with, only the Dao sect remains. That detestable sect. Our 3 sect leaders have decided to handle it personally once they emerge from seclusion. Haha, they truly are in for a treat. The Grand Elder sneered darkly. Grand Elder, word has it that Lin Dong of the Dao sect has returned. He seems considerably powerful, even managing to defeat Zhao Kuei. Oh? That little insect we drove out of the Eastern Mystery region like a stray dog 3 years ago? Powerful, you say? The Grand Elder chuckled coldly. Zhao Kuei only reached the revolution stage after using countless tricks. Such superficial strength. I'd crush him in an instant. It's actually for the best that Lin Dong took him out, sparing Yuan Sect further embarrassment. As he spoke, a savage grin twisted across the Grand Elder's face. As for Lin Dong himself, I'll make sure he understands that if Yuan Sect could humiliate him like a dog 3 years ago, we can just as easily make him beg like one today. Haha, indeed, Grand Elder, laughed the Yuan Sect elders nearby, their voices filled with twisted bloodlust. Within a massive formation, on a towering, suspended island, countless disciples of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace watched anxiously as the formation trembled. Hatred flared in their eyes as they glared beyond it. All disciples, form up. If the sect protection formation falls, prepare to meet the enemy head-on. A crisp voice resonated throughout the entire Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace, carried across by waves of primordial energy. Yes, responded countless disciples in unison. Their eyes turned to the figure in midair. A slender young woman dressed in green, her hair flowing in the breeze. Her face was familiar, a delicate beauty with a newfound resilience. This was Su Rou, who had once ventured into the 100 Dynasty War alongside Lin Dong. Yet the once timid girl had now acquired a strength and determination unknown to her before. Junior sister Su Rou called out a figure as it appeared beside her, casting a worried glance at the violently shaking formation. At this rate, we may not be able to hold out much longer. Su Rou clenched her small hands and bit her lip. No matter what, we must hold out until Sister Qingzhu completes the inheritance. Otherwise, all of the palace masters and elders' efforts will be for nothing. Her fellow disciple nodded, casting a glance toward an ancient hall at the island's center. But even if Sister Qingzhu completes it, all of our leaders have already fallen to Yuan Sect. Senior sister, Su Rou whispered, her gaze resolute. No matter the outcome, Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace will fight to the last. Right. Seeing Su Rou's fierce determination, the senior sister's eyes reddened. She bit her lip and hurried to command the disciples. Su Rou watched her leave, feeling a deep fatigue settle within her. In just a few days, the palace master, elders, and other leaders had fallen, leaving only a handful of revered disciples to defend the sect. The pressure was immense. Yet she suppressed her weakness, remembering the distant 100 Dynasty War, where one person, despite coming from a low-ranking dynasty, had fought fearlessly to the top. That person had taught her what it meant to defend something with unflinching courage. Big brother Lin Dong, I'm no longer afraid. To protect Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace, I'll face any foe. Su Rou smiled softly and lifted her gaze, her delicate face glowing with sacred determination under the setting sun. Buzz. The formation overhead shuddered violently, cracks appearing at last. Countless disciples gripped their weapons as waves of primordial energy surged within them. Boom. In the collective gaze of countless eyes, the final protective barrier shattered, and dark clouds surged in, blotting out the sky. Sisters and brothers, we may die, but the gates of our palace will never fall. As Su Rou faced the incoming dark cloud, tears streamed from her eyes. Countless disciples of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace had crimson light surge in their eyes, and then they rushed out like a tidal wave. One's body may perish, but the palace gates must not fall. Kill. The sounds of fierce battle reverberated across the sky, the setting sun casting a sinister glow, the scene extremely brutal. Far in the distant horizon, several streaks of light had already pushed their speed to the extreme, madly rushing toward the direction of Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace. Sharp sword blades howled through the air, carrying violent primordial energy, and blood splattered everywhere. Figures were sent flying, vomiting blood as they tumbled through the air, their bodies twitching and quickly growing cold. In their eyes, a trace of despair could still be seen. Countless figures surged out from the black clouds, sweeping toward the giant floating island in the sky, like locusts. The harsh sounds of battle echoed through the heavens and earth. The mournful screams and bloodshed made this land even more tragic. Su Ro, holding a long sword, slashed through the dozen or so Yuan Sect disciples around her, each one falling lifeless. A few drops of blood stained her green dress. Her delicate face looked at the blood-soaked ground around her, and sorrow flashed through her eyes. All disciples, protect the main palace. Su Ro shouted loudly, and with a surge of immense primordial energy, she struck back at the numerous Yuan Sect experts attacking from all sides, sending them flying, some spitting blood. However, in the face of the relentless tide of enemies, a pale complexion appeared on her face.
Yes.
Numerous figures around her answered in unison, forming a giant formation that surrounded the palace, blocking the wave of attacks from the Yuan Sect. But with each charge of the Yuan Sect disciples, more bodies of 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace disciples fell, and the defensive line was forced back. Even so, none of them retreated. Despite the despair in their eyes, there was no sign of giving up. In every place, there was a belief they held firmly, just as the disciples of the Dao sect held Lin Dong as their belief. The disciples of 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace had their own belief, one that they would never abandon. That belief was Ling Qingzhu. She was the most outstanding figure in 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace in 1,000 years. This was not only the belief of the disciples, but also the deep conviction of the palace master and many elders. As long as she had not fallen, 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace would remain like the silver moon in the sky, never setting. In stark contrast to the brutal battle outside, within the ancient and grand palace, there was an eerie tranquility. Enormous primordial energy gathered into streams, flowing through the entire hall. Within these currents of energy, countless sparkling crystals could be seen, dazzling like diamonds. These energy rivers converged into a very ancient and obscure formation. Around the edges of the formation, dozens of elderly figures sat cross-legged, their faces pale, as vast primordial energy surged out of their bodies, continuously flowing into the ancient formation suspended in midair. At the very center of the formation, the primordial energy condensed into a green lotus. On top of the lotus sat a graceful figure. She had ink-black hair, skin as white as snow, and eyebrows like willow leaves. Though a thin veil covered her face, her stunningly beautiful features still shone through. At this moment, her slender hands, like jade, formed a mysterious posture. Her fingertips lightly touched, and the space between her palms formed a miraculous arc, as though containing the entire world. An indescribable aura quietly emanated from her. At the front of the formation, a middle-aged woman with a beautiful face gazed intently at the enchanting figure at the center of the formation. The next moment, she suddenly bit her tongue, spitting a mouthful of blood into the formation. Her voice thundered, "Qingzhu, since the Supreme One." Pucci. Around her, the dozens of elderly figures also spat out their essence blood, their auras rapidly weakening. Their white hair withered, and some even began to fall off. The massive ancient formation seemed to shift subtly at that moment. In the next instant, the woman at the center of the formation trembled, and a faint light appeared above her head. This light was extremely faint, barely half a foot in radius, yet within that small area, there was an ancient and profound aura emanating, hazy and almost chaotic in nature. Seeing this, the elderly figures around her were filled with ecstatic joy. Their cloudy tears flowed down their faces as they struggled to rise and kneel before the beautiful woman in the center of the formation, bowing reverently. Could it be truly successful? The middle-aged woman with a pale face stared at the scene, her body trembling with excitement. She completely ignored her rapidly graying hair and laughed madly to the sky. Ha ha, after so many millennia, a disciple of 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace has truly sensed the Supreme One. We can die without regret. With a sharp laugh, The middle-aged, beautiful woman spat out another mouthful of fresh blood, her body quickly collapsing to the ground. The other elderly individuals also slowly fell, their breaths barely hanging on like drifting threads. Buzz. In mid-air, the vast, endless river of primordial energy roared down, pouring into the body of the stunning woman. Despite the fact that this infusion was something even ordinary revolution stage experts could not withstand, the woman in white absorbed it all. Swish. As the primordial energy flowed entirely into her body, her tightly shut eyes suddenly snapped open. Her gaze was as deep and clear as the ocean, vast and unfathomable. At this moment, there was a strange fluctuation in her eyes, one that seemed to transcend the world. However, this fluctuation vanished in the blink of an eye, and in the next moment, her figure appeared beside the rapidly aging middle-aged woman. She hurriedly helped her up, calling out in a tense voice, "Master!" At her call, the middle-aged woman slowly opened her eyes. She looked at the stunning woman before her with immense satisfaction. The blood at the corner of her mouth made her appear particularly tragic. "Qingzhu, you've really succeeded." Among the 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace, who else could be addressed in this way other than Ling Qingzhu? "Master, how are you?" Ling Qingzhu tightly embraced the middle-aged woman. At this moment, even with her usually cold nature, there was a slight quiver in her voice. "Heh, I've passed on all my cultivation to you. This life of mine is beyond saving." The middle-aged woman slowly reached out to wipe away the tears from Ling Qingzhu's eyes. "Don't be sad. Being able to see you sense the presence of Taiqing before I pass is the greatest achievement of my life. Master, you won't have any trouble." Ling Qingzhu's pearl-like tears fell as she sobbed softly. "Silly child, I was already severely injured. To be able to do this for you in my last moments, I am content." The middle-aged woman's face softened, and then she looked at Ling Qingzhu and suddenly said, "The one who ruined your innocence all those years ago. It must have been Dao Sect's Lin Dong, right?" "Huh." Ling Qingzhu froze for a moment, but then bit her red lips tightly, unwilling to speak. "You've been going to the Great Yin Dynasty every year for the past 3 years. Do you think your master didn't know what you were doing?" The middle-aged woman whispered. "But I never expected that my proud disciple would one day do all this for a man. That boy, he really is fortunate. He helped me in the alien demon region. I just wanted to return a favor. Master, please don't overthink it. Qingzhu has no interest in matters of men and women. All I want is to protect the 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace, ensuring its prosperity for eternity." Ling Qingzhu spoke softly. "You silly girl, ever since you returned from the Great Yin Dynasty that year, I knew what happened, but you stubbornly refused to speak about the one who ruined your purity. You were just afraid that your master would peel his skin and pull out his tendons in anger. Sigh. But that man, when he destroyed your purity, he also destroyed the Taiqing Sutra you had painstakingly cultivated for many years. That was necessary to sense Taiqing." The middle-aged woman sighed. "Master, the world is never perfect. Although my Taiqing Sutra was destroyed, it was through this misfortune that I was able to successfully sense Taiqing. Who can say what is truly a blessing or a curse?" Ling Qingzhu replied. "Even now, you're still protecting him. You've sensed Taiqing for decades, and only now are you beginning to touch it. That boy is certainly not insignificant." The middle-aged woman gave a bitter smile, then softly said, "I hope that boy really deserves you. You've sensed Taiqing now, though only at its preliminary stage. Your future achievements are limitless. Qingzhu, do you know the greatest secret hidden in our 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace?" The middle-aged woman suddenly asked after a brief silence. "I don't know." Ling Qingzhu shook her head, her eyes full of confusion. Despite her position in the 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace, she was unaware of the so-called secret. This only showed how deeply hidden it truly was. Since the first generation, our 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace has passed down a tradition among the palace masters. That is, our 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace, in the distant ancient times, had another name. It was called Taiqing Palace. Taiqing Palace? Ling Qingzhu was slightly stunned, then shook her head. She had read many ancient texts, but she had never heard of a powerful sect called the Taiqing Palace in ancient times. To be honest, our Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace isn't qualified to call itself the successor of Taiqing Palace. Of course, perhaps now, you are just barely on the path of Taiqing Palace, but you are still not truly part of it, the middle-aged woman said. And throughout history, only one person has ever stood at the pinnacle of Taiqing Palace. One person? Ling Qingzhu frowned. The person standing at the very pinnacle of this world. Master Ancestral Talisman. The middle-aged beauty's eyes suddenly filled with intense admiration and reverence. Ancestral Talisman? Ling Qingzhu's delicate body trembled slightly, her expression changing. The peak powerhouse who once led countless beings from this world in battle against those evil alien demons, is the founder of the Grand Palace? The Grand Palace wasn't created by Master Ancestral Talisman, but this name originated from him. In fact, none of us truly understand what the so-called Grand Palace represents, whether it is a sect or something even more mysterious. In terms of the Grand Palace, Master Ancestral Talisman is one, and his 8 disciples, the ancient 8 lords, among the Mice Lord is perhaps considered half, while the remaining 7 lords fall slightly short. However, I believe even they are unclear about the true meaning of the Grand Palace. It seems to be the greatest secret hidden within this world. From a certain perspective, you could be considered Master Ancestral Talisman's 9th disciple. Ling Qingzhu was momentarily stunned. This matter was too mysterious. Inexplicably, she was now linked to the most powerful figure in the world. Cough. After speaking these words, the middle-aged beauty suddenly coughed violently, blood pouring from her mouth. The remaining life force in her eyes quickly faded. Qingzhu, don't cry. Promise me? Promise me you will keep the incense burning at the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace, that its thousands of years of heritage will not be cut off from my hands. In her final moments, the middle-aged beauty tightly grasped Ling Qingzhu's hand, speaking in broken words. Then, her eyes completely lost their spark of life. Master! Ling Qingzhu cried out in despair, unable to hold back as she collapsed over her master's body, crying uncontrollably. The elderly elders in the palace, all severely injured, looked on with sorrow, their tears silently falling. Qingzhu, now is not the time to grieve. The Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace is facing the threat of destruction. We need you to act and preserve our heritage. One elder, suppressing his internal injuries, said in a deep voice. Ling Qingzhu gently wiped the tears from her cheeks, then, with a respectful bow to her master's cold body, she kowtowed 3 times. Her crystalline tears fell onto the ground, leaving faint water stains. Master, please rest assured. Qingzhu's life may end, but the gates of the palace will never fall. Ling Qingzhu's slender hands clenched tightly, the delicate veins rising on her jade-like skin. Then, she abruptly rose to her feet, sword in hand, transforming into a streak of rainbow light, filled with overwhelming sharpness, as she tore through the palace gates and charged into the storm of blood and battle outside. Amidst the chaotic battle and blood rain, her slender figure appeared like a phoenix in flames, slowly blooming into a wudong flower amidst the fiery storm, destined to turn to ash, yet resolute and unyielding. A tremendous surge of primordial energy erupted from Su Ro's body. Her sword transformed into countless sharp sword energies, immediately slaying dozens of Yuan Sect disciples surrounding her. However, facing the tidal wave of attacks, it was clear that her primordial energy would not last much longer. Her delicate face turned pale. Yet, even as waves of weakness surged within her, Su Ro gritted her teeth, staring at the sea of corpses around her. Her eyes reddened, a sense of helplessness welling up inside. At present, the attackers were only ordinary disciples of the Yuan Sect, while the truly formidable Yuan Sect elders stood aloof, watching their resistance with indifference. Once they made their move, the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace's defenses would instantly collapse. Right now, they were simply enjoying the frantic struggle of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace in its final moments. Su Ro, be careful. Just as Su Ro's mind began to drift, a sharp cry rang out. She suddenly snapped back to reality, her pores tightening as she saw 3 fierce sword strikes coming toward her. These attacks, infused with extreme fury of primordial energy, were aimed directly at her. These 3 strikes were incredibly sharp, and the attackers were clearly true experts from Yuan Sect. Each of them was as strong as Su Ro, and with all 3 attacking in secret, they sealed off all her escape routes. Given her current exhaustion, it was impossible for her to defend against them. Su Ro felt her weakening condition. She looked at the sharp sword strikes that were rapidly growing larger in her vision, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Was this really how the 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace was going to end? Whoosh! The fierce attack came in an instant, but just as the strikes were about to land on Su Ro's body, a streak of blue rainbow light suddenly pierced through the space, rushing toward her. In the blink of an eye, the 3 Yuan Sect experts at the great completion of the Life Mystique stage did not even let out a scream before they exploded into a mist of blood. Boom! Boom! The blue light continued its path, not diminishing, sweeping over the remaining Yuan Sect disciples, instantly clearing them from the battlefield. The sudden powerful attack caused the sounds of battle to falter, leaving the disciples of the 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace, including Su Ro, stunned for a moment. Then, they quickly turned their heads, only to be greeted by a pleasant surprise. In the distance, a beautiful figure in a flowing white dress appeared, holding a long sword as she walked slowly toward them. Her already cold and aloof aura now emanated an even more chilling presence. Senior Sister Qingzhu. As they saw her, countless disciples of the 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace cried out in unison. The morale, which had been wavering, immediately surged. Senior Sister. Su Ro gazed at the white-robed woman slowly walking beside her. Although the woman's face was still veiled by a thin gauze, Su Ro could sense the coldness and killing intent radiating from Ling Qingzhu's face. Little junior sister, you've worked hard. Ling Qingzhu looked at Su Ro, whose face was marked with exhaustion, and then glanced at the wounded disciples around her. Her jade hand, holding the long sword, trembled slightly as she spoke softly. Senior sister, protecting the 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace is also our responsibility. Su Ro shook her head. Ling Qingzhu nodded gently and raised her gaze to the sky, where dark clouds gathered. Within those clouds, disciples of the Yuan Sect continued to pour forth. In the center of the black mass, she could see several elderly figures. A powerful aura of oppression emanated from them, casting a shadow over the entire 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace. These figures were the true threat. Heh, finally, someone worth looking at. What? Where's your palace, Lord? The elder of the Yuan Sect looked at Ling Qingzhu and smiled faintly before adding, I almost forgot. She has been severely injured by me. Perhaps by now, she's already dead. Countless disciples of the 9 Heavens Taiqing Palace seethed with rage, their bodies trembling with anger as they glared at the Yuan Sect elder. Was it you who hurt our master? Ling Qingzhu's eyes, as cold as the moon, fixed on the Yuan Sect elder. Her jade hand clenched tightly, and an astonishing aura suddenly erupted from her body, soaring toward the heavens. The intensity of the aura was already at the revolving stage, but for some reason, despite it only being at the revolving stage, the danger it exuded was far stronger than that of even the top-tier experts who touched upon the cycle of reincarnation. Oh! The Yuan Sect elder raised an eyebrow, sensing Ling Qingzhu's aura. He smirked faintly and said, So it seems your palace lord passed on all her energy to you before her death. You're quite something. That kind of inheritance usually has a 90% failure rate, but you actually succeeded. However, so what if you receive the inheritance? The Yuan Sect elder sneered. Even your palace lord, who personally made a move, was defeated by me. A mere junior like you can't possibly be my match. Ling Qingzhu's autumn-like eyes remained calmly fixed on the Yuan Sect elder. Her gaze was so cold that even the elder's brows furrowed slightly. He shook his head with a mocking smile and waved his hand, saying, Kill her. Yes. A Yuan Sect elder responded respectfully from behind, stepping forward with cold indifference. As he did, a terrifying aura swept out from him, and a dark, evil gleam flashed in his eyes. This Yuan Sect elder was also at the revolving stage, but the power of his aura was clearly much more overwhelming than that of Zhao Kuei, who had been slain by Lin Dong. Clearly, the Yuan Sect had spared no expense in dealing with the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace. Little brat, surrender the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace to my Yuan Sect immediately, or I'll make sure to leave not a single soul alive in your palace. The Yuan Sect elder's eyes gleamed with coldness as he barked at Ling Qingzhu. However, facing his cold command, Ling Qingzhu's eyes grew even colder. She stepped forward slowly, and with a sharp motion, her long sword slashed diagonally through the air. Boom! As her sword struck, the very air itself seemed to boil with Yuan power. A blue streak of light cut through the void at an indescribable speed, as if even space itself was being sliced open. Watch out! The Yuan Sect elder's pupils shrank as he saw the attack coming, his voice rising sharply. Before his warning could even finish, the Yuan Sect elder felt his hairs stand on end. A sense of overwhelming danger flooded his mind, and in an instant, a vast force of Yuan power enveloped him, creating a protective barrier like a steel wall. Swish! Just as the defensive barrier took shape, the blue streak of light descended with an unstoppable force, and in that moment, the Yuan Sect elder's expression froze, along with the vast Yuan power that had surrounded him. Crack! A faint sound was heard as cracks rapidly spread across the impenetrable defense, and in an instant, with a loud crash, the formidable barrier shattered into pieces. And as the defense crumbled, the Yuan Sect elder's body exploded into a mist of blood with a deafening bang. The entire world seemed to echo with the sound of cold breaths being drawn in. No one could have anticipated that a super-powerful practitioner at the revolution stage would be instantly killed by a single strike from Ling Qingzhu. Whoosh! Blood mist rose, and a primordial spirit, tinged with dark light, attempted to flee. The anguished scream reverberated through the sky. Ah! You little wretch! How dare you destroy my body? I will never forgive you. Hemph! Useless! The Grand Elder's eyes flashed with cold light. With a flick of his sleeve, he pulled the elder's primordial spirit into his robe. His gaze then turned to Ling Qingzhu, who stood below, holding her long sword. Her eyes remained cold, but there was a faint pallor on her face, as if the previous strike had taken a considerable toll on her. Truly worthy of being hailed as the most outstanding disciple in the history of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace. Such strength, I fear even your master cannot surpass you. But today, do you think that with just your strength alone, you can save the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace? All Yuan Sect disciples, follow my command. Blood will wash the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace. The Grand Elder's hand swung down with fury, and his voice carried an aura of ruthless killing intent. Yes. Upon hearing the Grand Elder's furious command, the Yuan Sect disciples surged forth like a tide, their murderous intent filling the air. Su Rou gritted her teeth at the renewed assault from the Yuan Sect and was about to lead the disciples to resist. Little junior sister. However, just as she was about to act, she was stopped by Ling Qingzhu in front of her. Ling Qingzhu looked at the surging wave of Yuan Sect disciples and softly spoke. You lead the disciples to retreat. I will hold them off. Senior sister Qingzhu. Su Rou was startled. Although Ling Qingzhu had demonstrated astonishing strength earlier, the Yuan Sect's force was overwhelming. The most powerful Grand Elder of the Yuan Sect had yet to make a move. How could Ling Qingzhu alone possibly hold them off? Senior sister, we are not afraid of death. Let us stay and fight alongside the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace. The other disciples of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace hurriedly spoke, their voices filled with resolve. If you die, the legacy of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace will end. Ling Qingzhu gripped her long sword, and then her jade hand grasped an ancient token. Her cold voice resonated across the battlefield. In my capacity as the newly appointed palace master of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace, I order you to retreat immediately. Disobey, and you will be expelled from the palace. Senior sister. Countless disciples of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace cried, their tears streaming down as they knelt. The sea of people was overwhelming. If you don't want me to die in vain, you will listen to me." Behind the veil, there seemed to be shimmering tears that fell and dissipated with the wind. Ling Qingzhu lifted her head and faced the tide of Yuan Sect disciples, walking slowly towards them. Her slender figure, holding the long sword, appeared solitary and resolute beneath the setting sun. Qingzhu's body may fall, but the palace gate will never fall. Ling Qingzhu raised her head, her cold voice carrying a sense of pride that echoed through the heavens. "Such backbone," the Grand Elder of the Yuan Sect sneered, his eyes filled with endless cruelty. He then waved his hand, his cold voice spreading. "Kill. Leave none alive. Kill." The overwhelming killing intent seemed to darken the sky. The Yuan Sect disciples surged forward like locusts, their eyes bloodshot as they charged toward the beautiful figure holding the long sword, moving slowly toward them. However, their momentum seemed to have no effect on her. Her autumn-like eyes were calm and cold, without the slightest fluctuation. The veil covered her cheek, faintly revealing her perfect features. Even the murderous aura surrounding them seemed to freeze in place. That delicate figure stood firm amidst the tidal wave of Yuan Sect disciples' attacks, like a slender tree before a flood. It appeared fragile, yet it exuded an unshakable resilience. Behind her, the disciples of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace looked at her mesmerizing back, their eyes reddening. Some female disciples could not help but weep. Azure Lotus 10,000 Sword Technique. Ling Qingzhu finally stopped. Vast primordial energy surged around her, and above her, countless blue swords of energy formed in the air. With a light wave of her jade hand, the sound of sharp winds cutting through the air filled the heavens. The innumerable swords of energy shot out in all directions, colliding fiercely with the wave of Yuan Sect disciples. "Ah!" A chilling scream echoed through the air as blood poured out, staining the ground. The tidal wave of Yuan Sect disciples was forcibly halted by Ling Qingzhu alone. In the sky, the Yuan Sect Grand Elder gazed indifferently at the grievously wounded disciples below. Black light swirled in his eyes, but there was no trace of sympathy. "Chengpu, Wang Su, Su Li, you three go and stop her. This junior's attack is a bit strange, so be cautious and don't end up as useless as Su Ling," the Grand Elder of the Yuan Sect said indifferently, a hint of displeasure in his voice. Clearly, seeing Ling Qingzhu block the attack wasn't what he had hoped for. He fell silent for a moment before speaking again. "Understood." Upon hearing his words, three old men behind him, their faces dark and sinister, responded immediately. These three were just as formidable as Su Ling, who had been slain by Ling Qingzhu earlier. Clearly, they were top-tier experts within the Yuan Sect. The three of them moved at the same time, appearing in front of the Yuan Sect disciples in the blink of an eye. With a cold snort, they struck simultaneously, their eyes glowing with dark energy as surging Yuan power spread out like a tidal wave. It formed several protective barriers that blocked the vast flood of incoming sword lights. "Blood will stain the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace," the three coldly shouted. The Yuan Sect disciple, whose attack had been stopped, immediately responded with a bloodshot gaze, then charged toward the disciples of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace. Ling Qingzhu's eyes narrowed, her silver teeth clenched. But before she could move, a sharp whistling sound reached her ears. The three Yuan Sect elders had already surrounded her, trapping her in place. "Get out of my way." Her voice was icy, filled with a trace of anger, and came from beneath her veil. Her jade hand tightened around her long sword, and a flash of deadly intent flickered in her beautiful eyes. "Himph! All the elders of your Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace have fallen before us. How dare you, a mere junior, challenge us?" The three Yuan Sect elders sneered, not giving Ling Qingzhu any time to respond. Their vast Yuan power erupted, and with a flick of a finger, three enormous fingers of Yuan power shot toward Ling Qingzhu, each one like a massive pillar of the sky, intending to crush her. Boom! Before the giant fingers could land, the ground below collapsed for 1,000 feet, creating deep fissures that spread like a vast chasm. Ling Qingzhu quietly watched the fierce assault. In the next instant, her long jade hand suddenly came together. A brilliant blue light surged from her body like a tidal wave, and a gigantic blue lotus rapidly formed above her head. Bang! The three colossal fingers slammed down on the blue lotus, and a violent explosion of Yuan power erupted. Break! A cold command rang out, and at that moment, the blue lotus spun violently. The petals, sharp as blades, sliced through the air, cutting through space itself. As the lotus spun, the three giant fingers were shredded to pieces. The three Yuan Sect elders' eyes narrowed in shock. Although Ling Qingzhu's aura was at the revolution stage, how could her attack be this powerful? Whoosh! Before they could process the shock, the blue lotus shattered the three towering fingers and transformed into a streak of blue light, rushing directly at the three of them. Himph! Great primordial sky slash! The three elders' eyes grew cold. Each of them raised a hand, forming a blade shape, and with a mighty slash, their Yuan power transformed into three enormous saber beams. They cleaved through space, striking down at the blue lotus. Boom! The blue lotus couldn't withstand such a fierce onslaught and exploded in a brilliant burst. But just as it did, a streak of blue light shot out from the center, darting toward the three Yuan Sect elders like a ghost. Not good. The three elders' eyes widened in alarm as an overwhelming sense of danger flooded their minds. Their throats emitted a low, beast-like growl, and a wicked dark light surged from their eyes. Whoosh! The three elders reacted with lightning speed. Their palms turned black as they surrounded their hands with demonic energy, striking at the incoming blue light like a bolt of lightning. Wham! The blue light flashed, revealing a stunning figure. In her autumn-like eyes, there was a flicker of chaotic energy, and with a slight movement of her jade hand, three sword lights shot out. Essence! The blue figure flew past the three Yuan Sect elders, her long sword slowly sheathing. As she did, three blood-red streaks appeared at the elders' throats, and their heads flew into the air. Whoosh! As the heads flew, three strands of Yuan spirits hastily fled, attempting to escape. But this time, Ling Qingzhu was ready. Her eyes gleamed coldly as three more vicious sword strikes shot out, piercing through the fleeing Yuan spirits and shattering them. In the blink of an eye, three revolution stage powerhouses had fallen before Ling Qingzhu, and this time, she was even more ruthless, destroying their Yuan spirits without hesitation, leaving no mercy. Humph! However, as Ling Qingzhu dealt with the three elders, a soft groan could be heard from beneath her veil. Three dark palm prints marred her delicate shoulder, and fresh blood stained the veil, turning it a shade of crimson. But she paid no attention to the blood at the corner of her mouth. She simply lifted her head slightly, her cold, beautiful eyes fixed on the Yuan Sect Grand Elder standing on the black clouds, his indifferent gaze locked on her. To achieve this at such a young age, the first among the younger generation in the Eastern Mystery region, it seems there's no one else but you. Compared to you, those so-called three minor kings of the Yuan Sect are truly a joke, the Grand Elder of the Yuan Sect said indifferently. The first among the younger generation? Hearing this title, Ling Qingzhu's normally calm and cold eyes momentarily became lost in thought, and a scene from 3 years ago flashed through her mind. In that alien demon city, a young man covered in blood, holding a spear, faced off against the three great masters of the Yuan Sect. That battle shocked the entire Eastern Mystery region. "You're mistaken," she said slowly, her voice carrying an unshakable calm. "This title of the first, I fear it's not meant for me. I may perish here today, but..." A beautiful smile seemed to emerge from behind the thin veil covering her face. "I believe in the future, there will be someone who will wash your Yuan Sect in blood. Is that so?" The Grand Elder of the Yuan Sect, Lu Feng, sneered. "You now have the right to know my name. Although I know that countless young people in the Eastern Mystery region are mesmerized by you, it holds no appeal to me. Don't naively think that I will show you mercy." At last, Lu Feng slowly stepped out from the dark clouds. A dark, menacing aura began to gather in his eyes, and an overwhelming demonic energy rose behind him, blocking the sunlight above. Clearly, the Grand Elder of Yuan Sect could no longer hold back and was prepared to take matters into his own hands. Feeling the immense pressure coming from Lu Feng, Ling Qingzhu's delicate body shivered slightly, but she quickly turned her gaze to the disciples of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace, who were retreating while fighting. Her jade hand slowly clenched, and she pointed her sword at Lu Feng. Now, she had to hold back this Grand Elder from Yuan Sect, or none of the disciples from Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace would escape. Rest assured, I won't let a single one of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace disciples live, Lu Feng said with a faint smile, his grin cruel and savage. These Yuan Sect elders, who usually seemed ethereal and otherworldly, now appeared as the most brutal demons. Swish! Without responding further, Ling Qingzhu turned into a streak of green light, and her sword, like a flash of lightning, pierced through the air toward Lu Feng. Buzz! The sword light shot forward, but just before it could reach Lu Feng, two dry, withered fingers, covered in black magic runes, blocked the attack. Sparks flew, but the sharp sword light was unable to leave a scratch on him. Heh! Lu Feng sneered, his other hand clenching into a fist, the runes on his fist spreading like a dark, evil aura. Ling Qingzhu's eyes grew cold. She watched the violent punch coming toward her, gritting her teeth. Deep within her gaze, a mysterious chaotic light suddenly surged. Swish! The demonic fist tore through space, but just as it did, the vast Yuan power around her sword dissipated. The edge of the blade gleamed with a strange light, and then, with a sharp twist, it stabbed forward. In an instant, Lu Feng's two fingers flew into the air as the sword sliced through them. Blood poured out, but the blade did not stop. It headed straight for his heart. Boom! Just as the sword was about to pierce Lu Feng's heart, his terrifying demonic fist landed first on Ling Qingzhu's slender body. The overwhelming magic energy swept through the air, shattering space itself. Poof! A mouthful of blood sprayed from Ling Qingzhu's lips. The sword, which had pierced through Lu Feng's chest, could no longer move forward. Her beautiful eyes flashed with sorrow, and in the horrified gazes of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace disciples, her body was sent flying backward, blood blooming like a tragic flower. Senior Sister Qingzhu. The retreating disciples of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace, such as Su Rou, immediately screamed, and then, as if driven mad, they no longer withdrew. Instead, they charged toward Ling Qingzhu's position with all their might. Humph! Lu Feng glanced at his severed fingers, then at the sword wound on his chest, his eyes filled with killing intent. With a clenched fist, the demonic energy surged and formed a massive magic blade, sweeping through the air as it sliced toward the wounded Ling Qingzhu. Ling Qingzhu watched the magic blade charging toward her, biting her lip, her eyes filled with a mixture of helplessness and despair. This battle, they had lost. Would the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace disappear under Yuan Sect's butcher knife like this? Senior Sister. Su Rou watched helplessly as the fragile figure under the magic blade seemed on the verge of collapsing, and tears flowed uncontrollably from her eyes. Then, with a cry full of despair and anguish, she shouted. Her voice no longer as clear and crisp as before, but filled with overwhelming sorrow and despair. As the hoarse cry echoed through the sky, a sharp sound of wind tearing through the air suddenly rang out, reverberating across the land. The astonished gazes all lifted, only to see in the distance, the space itself distorting as a figure swiftly darted toward them like a flickering streak. Boom! At that very moment, the demon blade crashed down with a deafening roar. The earth trembled, splitting apart in massive fissures that spread like a spider's web. Countless shocked eyes turned toward the spreading dust. The disciples of the Nine Heavens Taiqing Palace, who had already lost all hope, saw their expressions dim with despair as their gazes faltered. Senior Sister. Su Rou slowly sank to her knees, staring blankly at the distant land. But as her vision blurred, she saw the dust begin to dissipate. On the cracked earth, a patch of ground remained untouched, and standing there, unharmed, was Ling Qingzhu. That is. A startled cry rang out. Su Rou quickly looked up, only to see a thin figure standing quietly not far in front of Ling Qingzhu. This figure wasn't imposing in stature, but it had withstood all the violent winds and forces surrounding them. That's Brother Lin. Lin Dong. Su Rose stared, her eyes wide in disbelief as a surge of joy she couldn't put into words flooded her face. She jumped to her feet, her cheeks flushed with an expression of utter astonishment and elation. Behind her, a chorus of shocked exclamations rose, causing Ling Qingzhu, whose eyes had been tightly shut, to slowly open them. Her gaze fell on the figure before her. She bit her lip tightly, and a drop of blood seeped from the corner of her mouth, but she forced herself to suppress the emotions churning within her. Slowly, she averted her gaze from that familiar silhouette. The figure ahead remained silent for a moment, then finally turned his head slightly. His eyes, filled with complexity, locked on Ling Qingzhu's silent, graceful form in the distance. A soft, gentle look slowly spread through his otherwise dark eyes. "Don't worry, as long as I'm here, no one will hurt you." The moment those hoarse words reached her ears, Ling Qingzhu, usually so composed, felt an inexplicable sorrow swell in her chest.